Well, welcome in again, Lynn Barger Elliott, a Presbyterian pastor. You've been a professor for many years, so we're excited to have you on the show again.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be back.
What I'm really excited to talk about today, last time we spoke a bit more about some heavy subjects, right? About death and fear of change. And a lot of folks really enjoyed that episode. And today we're going to talk about a different theory that you're also an expert in, one that involves all of us, not a theory about math or about economics or about relativity. We're going to talk about a theory called generational theory. So maybe with that, can you just in simple terms explain what that is?
We all want to better understand ourselves so we can create our best life and live our best life. And some of us turn to religion or philosophy. Some of us consult tarot cards. Some of us listen to podcasts. Some of us push our physical fitness to get a better understanding of who we are, what we're capable of. And I would say that there's a theory, generational theory, where the year that you were born has a huge impact on your sense of identity, your definition of love, even in the last week, your opinion on tariffs.
Interesting. Well, I guess that's a question that I did have for you is how is a generation defined, right? Like we say Gen Z, Millennial, Gen X. I don't even really know what this all means. Hopefully I'll learn it today during this discussion. But what are the ways that we define groups of people that come into the world at similar times?
Great question. And, there's, again, these are, social constructs. So it's not like history is defined by these generations. Right. But so I think some of this conversation started post-World War II when people were coming back from the war. That was a victorious war. And kind of technically, it's the last war that America won. It was a decisive victory.
I agree.
And, even with history, like how can you win a war now? That's debatable. But so people came back. There was a sense of we won, we've conquered evil, democracy prevails. And so it was a time of great optimism. And so people started having babies, building houses, buying stuff, even, the economy was booming and the population was booming. And so marketers looked at this and said, these children that are born post-World War II are boomers. And so that was kind of like, that was that. It was kind of left there and it was kind of a marketing term. And people didn't really think that much about generations after that. And then like fast forward 40 years, Tom Brokaw, who was a journalist, and he's 85, 87 now, as he was starting to be asked to deliver eulogies for his kind of contemporaries of his parents and at his funerals, he started looking at this generation and he defined them as the greatest generation. These are people that went to war, that stood for something, came back, felt like they were part of bringing America back to its strength again. And that these were world leaders, community leaders, church leaders, what in their neighborhoods, that there was a sense that these people had a allegiance and loyalty and a commitment to their communities, both time, financial, to their families, to their nation, and that he defined them. This is the greatest generation.
Okay.
Kind of people that have served in World War II, lived through, whether you were domestically or overseas, you lived through that and brought our nation to this great place. And so then you started doing the math in between and looking at that greatest generation gave birth to the boomers. So then people started thinking, well, what's next after boomers? And boomers, there's a lot of them. They're our largest population. They had a sense of optimism because they grew up during a prosperity.
Right.
Those years, we thought there was this arc of progression or progressiveness that we're evolving as a human race and as a nation. And Gen X was the generation after them, not their children, but so generation is maybe defined by like 20 years, give or take.
Got it.
They lived through Vietnam, which was not a decisive war. It was not even particularly a noble war. It wasn't
certainly not
we could be proud of. And they started living through some recessions and layoffs. And so Gen X became this strange letter that was assigned to this generation of basically being everything that the previous generation wasn't.
Ah,
Their world was something different. And it came from just a somewhat random Canadian journalist was observing the generations and just thought, like, this is Gen X. And so why we started putting letters on these generations is debatable. And why you start at the end of the alphabet. So, because
that is interesting.
letters to go before you. So then Gen X, and then they thought the next generation would be Gen Y, which some people refer to them Gen Y, which is millennials. And millennials, were born, came of age over the millennial. And then Gen Z was next. But of course, they're not going to be the last generation, or I would hate to be named that, knowing.
Right, right.
Then they've kind of circled around to Alpha, which, beginning of the alphabet. And that generation is basically 0 to 12 years old, starting like 2012 to 2015. So, and a lot of those delineations are they're 20 years. So that's typically what a generation is, which is interesting because in some cultures that's a generation. And then, some people have their first children in their 40s. So that's a longer
Right.
And so some of those delineations may be defined a little bit more with technology and what was coming there. So that's a big, long explanation on.
Well, that's so interesting is I never knew why we called these groups what we call them. And it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of rhyme or reason to it. But I will say that when you think of somebody who's part of Gen Z, right, versus somebody who's a boomer, apart from age, I do think there are like some fundamental defining characteristics that most people of those groups actually possess. And what do you think it is that is shaping these people? You noted technology. I think as well about like certain massive world events, like things like 2008, things like 9/11, things like wars. Are those also, those global moments really core to some of the psyche of a given generation?
I think so. And, you're always going to find an exception. We call it an old soul, and you just think like they're
Right.
not necessarily. But I think generally speaking, the post-World War II environment was positive, was, going in one direction. I think it's actually hard to imagine right now. And maybe we've, sugarcoated this, but in general, you could trust the government. The government was putting out water lines and electrical, they were creating spaces for suburbs to be built. They were creating schools. They were creating GI loans. They were making mortgages available. And so there was a sense of the government is helping me to lift me up and my family up. And so I would say, I'm not Gen Z, but I would venture to guess that that's not a Gen Z perspective.
No, and I would argue that it's not even I think I'm considered maybe a millennial. I think it's not a millennial perspective either. I think
Right.
government distrust has only increased with the passage of time. So that is a huge difference. But you look at like my parents, for example, it's a different story. Yeah.
Right. Like you might trust your bank. You might trust that they are going to navigate the economy the best they can so that we won't dip into too much of recession, or that there would be a safety net there. GI bills, that there would be a way to go to college, that we all want everybody to go to college, that we want colleges to succeed. And that's definitely, I would say, probably since Vietnam, there was this, since the early 60s, there's been a continually eroding of institutional trust. And that impacts churches, universities, Knights of Columbus.
I didn't think about the implications that would have on the broader institutions in our society. So not just government. I mean, we live in a society of institutions that you should be giving respect to, whether it's like you said, the police or the church or your local government. Those things, I think over time, the trust in them maybe has been eroded a little bit. And I don't know what the implications of that are, but I'm sure there are implications in the modern world.
Oh, yeah. Well, even a simple thing like banking.
Yeah.
It used to be that in your town, you went to the Bank of Moorestown, New Jersey. And like
Yeah.
it wasn't like First National Bank. That means nothing and is nothing. Like, where is that? And where-
Right.
Money going or First Republic or something. I'm sure they're great banks. It's
Of
no,
course.
but it doesn't mean anything. It used to be like the Bank of Pennsylvania, and you just knew, okay, I understand where these people live and invest their money, and I can go in and connect with that. Whereas now, a lot of people, particularly younger people, bank online. They don't have actually even a physical bank to go to. They don't have any, like, there's no person or location behind that. That's all
There's
their
no paper involved in my banking. Everything is done digitally. Like my father still keeps every bank statement he receives on a monthly basis and files them away in our basement. So I've never received a statement in my life. So just that crystallizes that exact difference.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And he certainly trusts the bank, and I do as well. But I think the way we engage with these systems is so different.
So different. Yeah.
Right. As far as, because look, again, I keep wanting to believe that we're all very similar, and maybe we are, and clearly there are differences. Do you find that there's any generation that's, I don't know if misunderstood is a good word, but a generation that's maybe trying to send a message or to do things differently that's not necessarily being heard or seen in the way that it maybe should be at this time? And I guess I'll start by just saying I work with some folks that are Gen Z. They've now just entered the workplace, and man, the way they approach work culture is just so different than even I, who's only, let's say, 7 years older than them, have been raised to do. And sometimes I kind of raise an eyebrow like, I'm not sure if I would do it that way. But I wonder if there are other examples of like, oh yeah, this or that would raise a similar kind of concern.
Yeah, and I'd be interested in your example, and maybe I'll just go through the generations in a minute. But the boomers live to work. They love to work, and you probably, if anybody that works in an office that with different generations around the table or in the office, boomers work till the project's done. If they need to stay late, or over the weekend, they live to work, and they'll think they'll retire someday, and that'll be a great retirement too. But they live to work. And Gen X looked at that and thought, you know what? One, I have a dual income now. I have a spouse that's also working, so I'm going to consider that.
Yep.
I saw what happened to my family in my parents' generation, and I'd like to spend more time with my family. And so I am going to work so that I can live. My goal is not to go as high up the ladder as I possibly can, but my goal is to find a place on the ladder where this feels like a good life. And that may be influenced by, I want to coach my kids' team. I have a spouse that also works, so I'm
Right.
not going to be relocated 20 times so that I can go up the ladder. I'm going to settle for this because this is the life I want. So I'm going to work to have that life. And millennials saw that and they thought, there's been a lot of layoffs. You could work for your life and you could live to work for 25 years and still be laid off and, dismissed right away. So I'm going to work so that I can have purpose and meaning, and that if I have value around this table, I don't actually care about a mentor that much. I just want to have value to this project. And it doesn't mean that I've only worked a week and that person's worked 25 years. Like, what can I add to this? And
That's
so
funny you say that because I'm a millennial and I actually feel that way. And I actually do think it's influenced in part by the fact that I did watch similar layoffs to those that you described around me, right? Close family members and friends' parents. Like I saw that all happen. And so now I know that this sounds cynical, but to some degree I feel somewhat dispensable. I feel valued in my workplace, but also I know that things can change in a second. And so what I'm chasing is purpose, is alignment. That's kind of my goal.
it's exactly your classic textbook.
Textbook millennial. Now, I'm curious to what you're going to say about Gen Z, because I could share some stories, but what would you say about the Gen Z attitude towards work?
Yeah, and I'm curious what you would say too. I think Gen Z is a little bit more utilitarian and practical about work. They view it as security, not necessarily a love, a passion, a purpose. And granted, these are wide paintbrushes,
Certainly.
So it's definitely more, I'm going to find stability in what I do, because I saw the millennials, which was great, but they may not have been employed the way they wanted to be, or they, maybe flip from job to job to job, but I need stability. And so I don't know if that matches what you have experienced.
I would say that the folks that are Gen Z that I work with, definitely, it's funny. they work really hard when they are contracted to work. So, well, it's 9 to 5 or 9 to 6. I'm in an industry where we work with a lot of boomers in this case that stay very late, and I almost would prefer to be in the office as opposed to being home. It's just the way they're programmed. You contrast that with these very young people that have come in that are going to say, look, I'm going to work as hard as I can from 9 to 6, and then at 6 o'clock, I'm going home. I don't care if everybody else is still here, but I'm going to leave as long as my duties are fulfilled. And so I don't know if those junior folks that have joined necessarily have the greatest passion or, for the role, but they do it, I think, as a means to an end, right? They want to come, they want to contribute, but then once they've contributed, they feel like it's okay to retreat back into whatever else is left in their life. And as somebody who was sort of brought up in a workplace culture where Gen Z did not exist, this is a new dynamic that I'm learning to live with. I don't think it's bad, but it's just new to what I've noticed. Yeah.
Yeah, really fascinating. And sometimes you might have a variation because you're product of your parents' work ethic or something like that.
That's
But
true as well.
really, yeah, I've worked in offices where, it's 5:30, so people leave. And so I'm like, wait, we're not done.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what mine is. Exactly.
And it's great that you have to leave, but this needs to be done by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And they're like, well, it's 5:30. So
Exactly. And some
so
people, some of the older folks in my office, and it's just so good to hear you say this, because I think this happens in a lot of places. They look at some of these young people and they're like, I can't even fathom doing that. But it's just not in their nature,
no,
due to certain
they didn't
reasons.
even realize. They
Right.
just 30. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's not because these young people are bad people. That's just how they are. That's just how they've cultivated their view of the world.
One of the reasons some of the generational studies emerged is that Harvard Business School started realizing, wow, for years we've just taught managers how to mentor or coach people up the ladder, so to speak, because
Yep.
it's assumed everybody wants to go as high or be as close to be mentored by the person at the top and get as close to the top as you can. And with Gen X, that ladder started flattening. And so they started realizing, wow, we're training managers that are, these people don't want to be managed in that way. And then,
I
of course,
see.
accentuated with millennials and then Gen Z, I'm sure that's different too. And in many ways, I think the boomers actually envy a piece of, it's
Oh,
like,
I
wow,
know they do.
say, I'm going to leave at 6 and see my family, or, I've got a basketball league that I do at night. And so you've got another life that you haven't postponed till retirement, but you've actually integrated that into your life. So, like, to your point, it's not good or bad, but really, I think it comes to play in a workplace where you see the generations around the table and how you collaborate. Do you want to collaborate? I mean, I'm a little bit more Gen X, and I'm like, collaborate? I don't know. I think I'll just do it.
And it is really funny. Like, in my workplace, things are distributed, right? We have some folks that are old as 70, and we have some folks that are as young as interns that are 18. And you just you see it very, very clearly. And I had not contextualized it in the way that clearly you have and you've studied, but there's definitely differences. How can we, using some of the things that you've said on this show, help to sort of better understand other generations?
That's a great question. I think it's really essential, right, for productive workplaces to be able to at least ponder that question. And,
Right.
I think for whether you're boomer or you're Gen Z or you're a millennial looking at a Gen Z, just to think this isn't a bad person and they actually value the work that we're doing from 9 to 5, but there may be a time when I have to say, hey, I know this is a big ask, but is there any way you could stay a half hour longer and help us finish this? And so just maybe anticipate this is going to be a time where we're going to need an extra ask. And then there's going to be other times where we say, hey, we're done, let's go early. Or just, let me back up and just say, I think understanding that there's different, ethics is probably too strong of a word, but approaches towards work and your identity on the team, just understanding that and even maybe naming it and saying, like, I'm a boomer, this is going to be my default.
Yeah.
And so maybe even just talking about that as a team and saying, how can we maximize everybody's contribution around this table, knowing that I respect that you're going to want to leave at 6 because you have a basketball game that you take your kids to. And so that's really important. And I want to value that. So can we work over lunch, or like, can we just, I think just maybe talking about those things and anticipating how another person's going to approach it and what's going to be their value. And also seeing it not because they're like, if they want to leave at 6, it's not because they don't like the workplace or don't like you or have a negative feeling about it. They actually have a positive perspective on life balance or their own family that they need to get back to, or to a life. They maybe have a life that you don't.
Right. Well, that's put bluntly, but it could be true. And I also think these differences amongst cultures and amongst generations are sort of exemplified in the workplace. I don't think there are many places other than the workplace where you are actively mingling with folks from all different backgrounds all day. And so that's, I think, where you can see some of this stuff most clearly, because other than that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that most people gravitate towards others that are around the same age as them and might share the same worldviews. And so where else do we spend time with those that are generationally different than maybe at a workplace? Are there any other places you can think of, or is that really the one where these differences are highlighted the most?
Well, I think it's certainly highlighted the most there. And also at work, you're convened to contribute to a project. And you're supposed to be going. So, maybe you all belong to the Y or like the gym, but you're all doing something different. I think like a family reunion, like you're not there for the purpose of, working on a work project or something like that. So I think all those differences are accentuated. In other places you can forgive them. But I think for any of your listeners that belong to an organization, maybe we look at a political party, you look at like a church or a civic board, there's different ways that, maybe younger people say, well, let's just do a fundraiser and let's do a silent auction or let's just have like trivia night and sell drinks and tickets or something. And, the boomers are like, well, how about we all pony up $10,000 and just skip that. Like you're going to spend $10,000 at an auction. So why don't you just, or whatever, whatever numbers. But, or, you look at, I don't know, I'm looking, the Republican Party is certainly, well, I don't know if they're unified in things, but, the parties are trying to figure out how do we capture all the generations and how do we ensure that we're going forward? Or you look at, I don't know if you're on a board for your library or your YMCA or whatever, there's certain different generations come around the table. And do you even want to be on a board? That's another thing. I come from a church community and a lot of people will say, hey, I'll volunteer for, call me some Saturday. I'm totally open to doing that. But no, I don't want to do a year-long commitment or 3-year-long commitment. And yeah, I love this place. It's been, really special to me. It's important. It's made an impact. I'm committed to the institution, but I don't want to commit. So that's another thing, like volunteerism. That's another place where you see the impact of generations. You look at our communities and you look at like the plaques that are on all these libraries and buildings and things that, Cornelius Vanderbilt or Jackie O put all this time into building Grand Central. And, that wasn't their job. That was things
of course
created for the community. And do people have that willingness to put that much time and effort into a cause anymore? A lot of younger people don't, because they kind of don't see themselves as being a really strong agent in impacting the community and the world. Whereas I think before you could there's a sense of optimism that if I put a lot of time and effort into this, I'll make an impact. And I think there's some disillusionment on the impact that you can make on communities and in, your own civil rights and I don't know, maybe I'm projecting that, but I do think that there's a little bit more of a retraction on wondering just how much impact you can have on the world around you.
I don't think you're projecting that at all. And in fact, even in conversations with my peers and colleagues and those younger than me, I think there is a general belief that our collective agency in our lives and the agency to make change in the world around us is a little bit less. And that is interesting, just given the fact that I do think our world is always changing and things are chaotic. And, as recently as with, let's just say, the crazy market volatility, like things don't ever stay the same here. But I do think that young people feel like I'm not even going to try because if I tried, nothing would change. And I don't exactly know why that is, but that's just worth noting. And I think some people would agree. And I know that the young people that I know would agree that can be a little bit demotivating sometimes. And so I think as we look forward, that is something we can work to kind of collectively fix or change or supplement. But I do want to ask, speaking on the future, we've talked a little bit about what has happened in the past and what is occurring right now. But as far as the generations that are coming into the world today, babies being born today, like where are we headed from a generational standpoint? And how different does the world look today than it did when I came into the world, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, one, who's to say?
Yeah, right.
Two, you're the beneficiary of just access to so many resources and so much knowledge. And, you don't have to go to the library and research the card catalog and go see how the book is on the shelf.
Because even I had to do that, contrary to popular belief. I know I look young, but I did have to do that. I know what a VCR is, right? Like I'm that old.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
But it's definitely impacted mental health. In one way, there's so many options that it can be paralyzing in some way.
I agree.
And you don't know, did I do the right thing? Did I not do the right thing? I joke that I'll go shopping with one of my daughters and they'll say, they're trying something and say, do you think this looks good? And I'm like, yeah, I think it looks great. Why don't we buy it? Okay. And then she goes into her dressing room and comes out like 10 minutes later, like, well, Lily and so is great, but so-and-so doesn't think it's great, so I'm not going to buy it. I'm like, I thought you and I were deciding this.
Right.
This whole other population that you're helping make decisions, which is good, but you're also not relying on your own instinct about that or the moment that it's happening, thinking it's not good or bad, but it changes the way you think about yourself and your own ability to make decisions. And that's, looking at a dressing room. I don't know if that's the best example, but so there's sometimes a paralysis that we just have so much at hand. I don't know if you saw the New York Times this morning. There's an article on Gen Z and finances and dysmorphia, I think is the right term, talking about just the comparison of, am I living, or like how are others living? And it looks like they're living a glamorous life. It looks like they're spending money on spring break and they're doing all these things, which I thought was interesting that they even talked about spring break, because spring break's something that you have when you go to school.
Right.
But they were referring to where you go in spring break. But just the sense of there's one thing to have an iPhone that technology has increased and brought incredible access and things right to your fingertip. But the social media piece of it, of just constantly comparing and constantly putting your life up against others. And so this article was just saying that people are very skewed on either they are financially fit, but they don't think they are.
Right.
Or they really can't afford anything, but they spend too much money. And so there's this distortion in how they are looking at the reality of their financial situation. And a lot of it is because they decide who they're going to compare themselves to on social media. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting article, but I think I don't want to be a downer on this, because I think love my phone and I love social media and I use it, and I think in pretty positive ways. But I do think there's no doubt that mental illness, rates of suicide have increased significantly. And
Certainly.
I think there's, it's not all social media. They don't equate that if you follow social media, you'll do this, but there definitely is a connection. And so I would hope, and I know that, I know personally some people that are working with social media, Instagram and Facebook, to create child safety policies
Yeah.
and parental controls. And so there's people working towards that. But I think an attentiveness to how much time we spend on social media, but then how much time we're not spending with friends. And there's a social psychiatrist or psychologist that I like to read, Jean Twenge, who teaches at University of California, San Diego. And she talks a lot about the more younger people or more adults too. This is not just a young person thing. More time on social media, the less time they're spending with friends.
Oh, I could see that.
And that's actually the huge impact, that we're not bumping up against strangers, acquaintances, spending time with friends. I was just talking to somebody a week or so ago that said, his daughter's been dating this guy for a year and she's a senior. And, Saturday night, he said, "So what are you doing?" She's like, "Oh, I'm just hanging out. I think I'll just FaceTime with," she said, "Aren't you going out with your boyfriend?" And she said, "Oh, I think we'll just FaceTime." And he just thought, like, when I was a high school senior, like you went and did things.
Of
Not that one
course.
is better, but there's something just good about the physicality of getting out of your house and doing something with other people. And so I suspect, and I think that we talked about this the last time we talked, that it's just important to connect, whether with strangers,
Yes.
acquaintances, other human beings.
Yes. 100%. And to your point, I think for as good as social media has been, and as much as I think it intended to connect, quote unquote, connect people, I think it has contributed to a young generation that is lonely, and has some imposter syndrome and fears, and has FOMO. And I guess I just hope that as access to information increases and everybody's lives become more and more public, newer generations can find healthier ways to distill through the noise, focus on the things that really matter, and not let it affect them in the ways that, when this first technology was brought to us, I think people didn't really know how to deal with it. Like me being 10 years old and getting an Instagram, I didn't really know how to deal with that. But I think net, maybe it's been neutral, not positive, not the worst thing, but there have been times where it's made me feel less than. So I think the next generation, to your point, will be defined by this new era where we can access anything. We have artificial intelligence, right? We don't really have to leave our house to eat.
Right.
We don't have to, leave our house to connect with friends. So it'll be a really interesting, I think, next 30 years. And I think the babies that are being born right now, in a way, I'm envious of them, but in a way, I'm sort of glad I'm not them. Yeah.
Yeah, you brought up another interesting thing about adulthood and feeling like an imposter. Which
Definitely.
is an interesting word. And historically, like since the beginning of humankind, there was childhood and adulthood. And there was this sense of adolescence, the term adolescence, and the just understanding having a universal understanding of what that word means is probably not even 100 years old.
Okay.
It's a very new concept. And it used to be you were a child who played and played around, maybe in the safety of whatever your home context was. And then at a certain age, your parents and family and community had kind of mechanisms to prepare and equip you to be an adult.
Okay.
And so at that stage, you had maybe this interim, like a bridge, maybe between being a child and being an adult, but it was very intentional. That stage, that bridge, so to speak, that transition time was to prepare you to be an adult. And it was very clear you needed to learn how to manage a household or to run a business. And, everybody understood what was happening in that interim stage of life. The definition of adolescence now, that interim stage of life, is very different.
Okay.
And some of that had to do with, in the early 1900s when it was mandated that states needed to provide high school education. So all of a sudden, instead of being equipped for adulthood by maybe adults or people that were further along or mentors, you were put with peers and kind of decided that we'll train people to be adults by putting them with peers, which may or may not be a good idea. But there was a development of a sense of adolescence as being, it used to be a recognition of you are now at a stage of life that we believe we're going to equip you to be an adult.
Yeah, right.
pretty early on in the early 1900s, it became this stage of you're reckless, you're hormone driven, you are not responsible, you can't, you're not an adult. And it very early shifted in the 1900s where instead of being a kind of a noble and important and directed time of life, it became this like holding pool
Yeah.
for people that weren't adults. And before we had this sense of adulthood is pretty clear definition. You can support yourself. You have engaged in a relationship and you are basically going to replicate the household that you grew up in, or you're going to live independently from the household that you grew up in, and you're going to replicate that. One of the things, and so that was adulthood. Is he an adult? He has a job, got a spouse, and lives independently from
By the
his
way,
parents.
I like how simple that is. That feels to me right. Like, and nowadays, I think maybe it might be different. You might get to that, but that to me feels, I can wrap my arms around that.
But what got kind of nebulous is that definition of adulthood became blurry because one, we put people in high school not necessarily to prepare for adulthood. They're just kind of there to not enter the workforce in some ways and to learn from their peers, not necessarily to prepare for a job. But one of the questions that I would often ask my students is, in your household, what definition of adulthood was assumed, whether it was spoken or unspoken?
Interesting
And it's
question.
fascinating. Like in my household, I think it would be pretty clear that you graduate from college.
Okay.
And then like I remember the day I graduated, my dad pulled me aside and gave me a checkbook and said, I think there were a couple $100 in there and said, you're responsible now for your rent and car payment. And, if you get in trouble, call us. But like, this kind of the transition time. In some families, it's when you get married. And so if you don't get married till you're 30 or 40, you're not quite ever seen as an adult until you're married. One student said that in his family, you're an adult when you served in the military, and he wasn't going into the military. So he didn't feel like an adult. Some people think it's when you first get your job. And there's these messages that we get, but we've extended that beyond for different reasons. I mean, we might not get married. We might not have the job that we want. We might not be able to support ourselves with our job independently. And so adulthood wasn't just this like quick bridge from childhood the adolescence wasn't this bridge that we traversed between childhood and adulthood. It became this extended time that some people, like one of my students said, I will not be considered an adult in my family till my father dies.
So effectively, this has gone from what was maybe once a one-size-fits-most description to now there might not be a true answer. And I don't know how that affects people. That might make them feel childish for too long, or make them feel out of place when they see others doing things and they're not. I can just imagine how, for example, for that individual, he's probably going to be a grown person, hopefully with a family and people he supports, and still doesn't feel like he's reached adulthood. That's an interesting mental space to be in.
And I could say I know people like that feel like even though they're married, they live in their own house, they're independent. If they don't have a child, which they may not have a child by choice or by necessity or finances or biology, we don't know, but that they never feel like an adult in the eyes of their parent or maybe even in their own eyes.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think the reason that so many people don't feel quite like they're adults yet, or that they're kind of playing a game, is we have a varied understanding of what it means to be an adult, and that isn't always helpful.
No, it definitely isn't. And look, my listeners know that I'm the first one to raise my hand when somebody says something that I also feel. And that's certainly something that I'm feeling right now. I do not feel like an adult. In some ways I do, in some ways I don't. And I don't know if I ever will. And I'm hopeful and optimistic that some other, what I would consider adults, would say the same thing. Like, hey, I've got kids and a wife and a house, and I also still feel like a kid in some ways. So, my whole life I always was so excited to like be an adult. And now I guess I'm here. Like I'm an adult by all classifications. And A, I still feel like a kid, and B, I kind of still want to be a kid. So adulthood is an interesting place to be, especially young adulthood. But hopefully through conversations like this, and for me to, be able to just contextualize where other people are at in their own lives, it's helpful for me to just feel more comfortable in my own. And what I would ask you, I guess, maybe in closing is if somebody was trying to bridge gaps or build something, whether it's like a company or a resource group or a podcast that, connects with people across generations, what are some of the fundamental things that you believe all of us share, despite being a boomer or a Gen Z or a millennial?
I think we want to feel valued.
Certainly.
We want to feel loved. We want to feel that our time and effort, whether it's at a workplace, in a community, in our families, that's respected and recognized. And I think, just going back to your question earlier about, managing the workplace, I think just knowing, okay, this person wants to be respected, wants their work valued, wants to be loved, wants to most people want to be in some kind of a relationship that they have a companion. Most people want to have some kind of outlet for leisure and, recreation. But it might look different. And
exactly right.
Prioritize that differently. But I think at our core, those are things that we're all pursuing. And so, I think of like a family reunion or a time with sitting with your grandparents or your parents, just paying attention to, I know they value these things too, and I'm going to listen to the clues for how they do it differently. And I hope that they hear my clues of how I value what they value. I'm just doing it in a different way, or I have a different approach or different priorities in making that happen in my life.
Yeah. By the way, I really appreciate the way that you framed it. And I think that those are the fundamental things that we're all after. And I think most of us are after the same end goal, which is just to feel a level of purpose and to find a life that makes sense for us and to find agency in our lives, and build something that we think is special. I think if we are not pursuing those things, then what are we even doing out here? I think most people have those aims, and the way we get there and the things that impact, our thoughts along the way clearly differs. But this is helpful as I interface with people all different ages and types every single day to remind myself that at the end of the day, we're all striving for very similar things. We're just doing it in different ways.
Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you enough for another incredible episode. Now I feel like we need to do a whole nother one on what it means to be an adult. Like that 10-minute segment was incredible, and I want to learn more. So thank you, Lynn, as always.